동아 취재지 초와 심발라 대화 ranzamba 샴바니 들어와 세진도 주발라 시다가시 가주바 대신 동아 취재와 대오냐도 삼바체스 동아 취재비 아니 군전지 있을 걸 제부 동아 취재비 군전지 제부 대화니 예도 샤나
So the next verse is verse 46, which is dealing with the topic of how worldly beings think that the satisfaction that derives from a sensation of the mere alleviation of suffering is actual happiness. And the person might think as follows, that, or here actually the verse begins by saying, thinking the alleviation of pain is pleasure is like someone who feels delight vomiting into a pot made out of gold, a golden pot.
추보가시 세진도 주바라 치다가시 가주바 세가라 아니 미추보가시 세진도 아니 주바나 전부 사이네도 주바 토네 주바라 대화메 바캬바 매장 사이네도 주바다 세진도 주바장 캬바 매장 추보가시라 나네 왕다 피순 사와오 냠도 추보가시 가라 주바 티신도 대신도 동아시 치를 줘봐야 아니 숙충우서에 내가 지 초화선 발사다 가상 공도 대중 공도 지와나现在가 동아 치를 줘봐면 동아 충수 상황라 치를 줘봐면 숙충우서에 내가 지 초화선 발제라 아니 란잠비 대화소네스 초대와 란잠바 송만 돌아 란잠비 대화소네 대오냐도 삼바쳐와 인지 태안달 동아 치르쳐봐들라 대화 란잠바 요한 말이스 대화 치르쳐와라 대화 삼바자마데 대화 란잠바 요한 말이스.
So one might think as follows, that pleasure does exist. Pleasure caused by the alleviation of pain exists. But the reply to that is that's not the case. When a rich man who is vomiting into a gold pot sees his servant vomit into a clay pot, though vomiting is equally unpleasant for both, the rich man thinks how prosperous he is. Like the rich man who feels delighted when mistakes for real pleasure the feeling of satisfaction when pain has been alleviated and become less acute. But there is no real pleasure at all. And so here, this is, as we've said previously, that ordinary worldly people see the alleviation of the removal of some kind of discomfort, some pain that they're experiencing, as if it was pleasure. And but that satisfaction, temporary satisfaction that one experiences from the removal of the gross manifest suffering is not real pleasure. It's simply we consider it to be such.
Oh, that 되게 better. That 다시 시원하시잖아요. 배나 님의 동네 아니 님하고 차와 동안 동네 아니 틈나라 두비 채나스 나를 님의 집이 동아대 아니 숙충도 추위 갑기 아니 좋았음 바텔라스 숙충도 소마 숙충까지 좋았음 바텔라 아니 동아 취지지 대화写下라스 차외년 비 동아지 숙양 야마타비 장유 동아지 고추배 사유 동아 고추배 동아 예매비 소와 미식배 예미식배 소와 미식라스 지된비 소와 동아라니 티 시를 소와 대화 숙충과 짬양 그와 민노세로 데세도와 지된비 소와 동아라니 티 시를 소와 동아 숙충과 짬양 그와 말했어 소와 동아라.
So then the example that's given for this is that when one is afflicted with the sun, when one is beaten down by the sun, the heat of the sun, when you sit in the shade for a moment, then the suffering of that being burned by the sun disappears for a bit. The force of that being burned disappears for a while. And then there's a temporary moment of relief that one experiences, the sensation of relief. And that's what is called the pleasure that arises from the alleviation of suffering. But that's not real, actual pleasure. The discomfort, the power, force of the suffering discomfort that one's experienced from heat dissipates somewhat. But at the very time that occurs, the suffering of becoming cold begins. So there's no such thing. It's impossible to have a sensation which is completely free of suffering in the world. And worldly sensation is suffering, and that serves as a foundation such that the 초월대와 숙충오참 급하면오스 초월대와 숙충오참 양 급하면오스 초월대와 그래서 초월대와 숙충오참 양 초월대와 숙충오참
초월대와 숙충오참 자면 그와 많이 넣었어요. 초동아라니 동아와 뒤실라 초월대와 숙충오참 그와 말했어요.
So then it's not the case that it's I'm sorry, I lost where we were. That's not. And it says here in the translation, there is no pleasurable sensation which is entirely free from discomfort, since ordinary people's pain does not require even a weak pleasurable feeling as a basis in relation to which it is established. It is said that ordinary people have real suffering but no real pleasure.
No. Oh yeah. Tena jideba namla dunga ranzan ba yue las. Dunga ranzan ba yue. Roa dewa ranzan ba me chao se dunga ti gula shidam tanja dunga ji rashin la de yung wo zwa me ba. Jide bin dewa shidam tanja ane de yung wo la ane dunga ji wo zwa. ane dunga chilchewa la dewa ngamba za mato ranzanji rawa dewa jeme ba inzang ane dewa ranzan ba me che chao.
Thus, that being the case, then worldly persons don't, we would say that worldly persons have real or actual suffering, but they don't have real actual happiness or pleasure. The happiness or pleasure that is experienced by worldly persons is simply the alleviation of some pain, temporary alleviation of some pain or suffering, and it's misidentified as if it was actual or real pleasure. But it's not. It's simply called that.
탄예도 초안 대화 매비테는 말이 탄예 초안 대화면 초안 대화 예장 초안 대화데 아라오미 대화 좀 말이 고동아 칠제월 대화랑 맞아 마도 아라오미 대화지란 대화랑 잠 봐지와 말 마도 초안 대화 매제開랑도 미루데 아니 군데서 주비체로.
On the other hand, we can't say that there's no such thing as pleasure at all in the world. There are pleasurable sensations, but so we have to say conventionally that that there is something that's called the sensation of pleasure or happiness. But because that pleasure or happiness doesn't have an autonomous character, it's not actual or real pleasure or happiness, and therefore it's not suitable to be called actual or real happiness, although it's nominally or in the world conventionally designated as pleasurable sensations. But if you were to go so far as to say there's no pleasurable sensation whatsoever, then one would be exceeding what the case and would be underestimating that which actually exists.
No. 나디 배라 옹보데 세보단 저장 옹빌로 기 세빌로 미게바당 人不的台湾讲切人话当真呢，同意逻辑，아니 개바다 시와 차이 있어. 초안 대화데 고란 초안 대화에 초안 대화랑 좀 많이 봐.
So the way this works is that we have to say there is pleasurable sensation that does actually exist, but it's not real or actual pleasurable sensation in the world. Worldly experience doesn't involve actual, real pleasurable sensations, although there are things that are called pleasurable sensations. They do exist conventionally. And so the example that illustrates how this works is if we juxtapose blue and yellow, a patch of blue and a patch of yellow, then it's the case that the blue, we would see blue when it's superimposed upon something that's yellow or covers something that's yellow, but we wouldn't see that which is yellow in that, the thought yellow would not occur in that case. But when we, on the other hand, when we juxtapose or place next to each other one thing which is long and another thing which is much longer than that, it's the case that we would think towards the thing that is long that it's short in comparison. So the same thing applies, the way we apply this to pleasure is that there is some kind of nominal or conventionally something called pleasurable sensation within the worldly context, but it's not real or actual pleasure in the ultimate sense.
Oh yeah, that the ranzan ba se ge ranzan ba de gachi ranzan la me sha ba gacha 동반 이제 가자 ranzan me ko ko me sha wa so 다지 최 다지 같이 최 이건 같이 지 ranzan dan ra wa ko me sha wo se 다디 베베de 가라 고문도 빼나 따단지 님 봐라 내가 삼바다 자고 가르쳐도
타동 맨라 타동디
따단지 님 봐라 내가 삼바다 자고 사디 주셔야.
So then there's a point that needs to be clarified here is that when we're talking about something not being actual or real pleasure, the worldly pleasurable sensations are not actual or real, one shouldn't misconstrue that as the word that's being translated as actual or real. It is similar and has a similar connotation to the something having an intrinsic identity or existing by means of its own intrinsic identity, which is the subject to be negated by reasoning when one's determining the understanding the ultimate nature of things or delineating emptiness. So this case of using the word actual or real doesn't have the same connotation. It doesn't have the same range of meaning as the notion of something being real, which is negated when one is establishing the ultimate nature of things. So, and then the example that's given to show how it is that this what we call pleasure or happiness in the world is not real pleasure is like it's like when somebody thinks that eating horse dung to alleviate an illness is pleasurable. It's similar to that.
Oh yeah, that the one ranzaba maybe 균제 현당 바텔라. 다 subject 하셔야 되고 로와 동아 중국 잠배 등 동아 첨부现多把通完대화 ranzaba也把没主把他所以就为了동아 레버 세주年比대화没把他당보다 동아 중국 잠배 동아 첨부现多把通完대화 ranzaba也把没主把他당보 동아 중국 잠배 동아 첨부现多把通完대화 ranzaba也把没主把他那对暂别结完多久呢？东岸转把电器业，其他特别接近的东岸也是送吧，是吧？我对了，2月的差不今年差不2万库保险，台了等于落中啊大不得是，库的咱把差不今年按你。东岸话的差不多，你沿途别话之前呢，台了台湾落穷啊，大不得。台湾面呢， 미보가 쉬고
So then the next topic is
미보가 쉬고 신나서
so then the next topic is showing that the reasons why there is no such thing as real happiness or pleasure here again understood within the context of worldly experience. And the first topic of that is showing that we see in our own experience how some sort of small pain can occur when, as sort of the beginning of the alleviation of a greater pain or greater form of suffering. And because of that experience or seeing that we can see that there is no way to establish worldly pleasure as being actual or real pleasure or happiness. And that's given in verse 47. By beginning, it stops the produced or produced, yeah. How can pain then that begins be pleasure? It seems the sage therefore said both birth and cessation are suffering. So here someone might say pleasure does exist because when, for instance, one moves a load from one shoulder to the other, a sense of pleasure arises. If there were no pleasure, one would not move it. And then the answer is given in the verse itself.
Oh yeah. 다들아 차바예바기 아니 쿨 이런도 체외 동아 첨부 폐와나 안 된다고 쿠데 연바라 보라 보아 태양 안에 당부 동아 나르지 아니 가서래 차바예바 아니 쿨이 동아데 충우 잠바야 당부 동아 충우 잠배 ngārji dungā chenpo jewa de doba jewa tsam tu se de se ngārji dungā chenpo de chil jewa tsam la ane kāso de dungā chenpo jewa doba jewa tsam tu se de se yinba pewa tala dungā mepa manya dungā mepa mina se dungā shen zomba yang shen dewa jiyue de dungā chenpo gashi le dewa jiyue se kansi de yinza zambe jewa doju na dungā zomba de jiyue se timba de现在把那台湾企业，东岸全部搞新巴拉样，台湾企业是。
So the answer to that is given in an example. If you've got a huge burden that you're carrying on your right shoulder, and you've carried it for a long time on your right shoulder, then the suffering, the pain that you experience from that increases for the duration that you're carrying it. And when you shift the load over onto your left shoulder, what you have happen is that right at the beginning, a small discomfort or suffering occurs when you shift it over to your left shoulder, but and what you have is a relief of the big suffering that you've been experiencing previously. And so it's merely the reversal or alleviation of the heavy suffering that you were experiencing before. And it's not the case that there's some that you're actually free from suffering throughout that process. Because what's happening there is that some new suffering has been initiated at that very time, and when you've given up one heavy suffering, but some new suffering is starting, how can you call that happy, pleasurable, or all it is the stoppage of that heavy suffering that you've been undergoing, and in what way is that really real happiness?
오야 아니 가서래 대지 투배 제지다 동안이시 숨바냠 세대라 아니 깨와나 동안 가시 가베 아니 동안 치체바라 치체바지민지 더런거 맞자민지 아니 더원양도 메르바 티셔를 더원양도 메르바 티셔를 아니 대지 투배 제지다 손이가나 투배 까다야 나라 대배 돌아 까다야나 붙게와 나야 동아 코나 껴 가바나야 동아 코나 가고 시승바 냠데 좀바보 라니자 대다 셈소 시와오 오야
So then this is further explained in that when one is born, all that is the stoppage of the cessation of some prior suffering. And one might think being born is happiness or bliss, pleasure. That's incorrect. And the reason for that is that the sage has explained in the sutra that he addressed to Katyayana. And it's, in that sutra, he says, "O Katyayana, when one is born, what has happened is only suffering has arisen, has been born. When one ceases, likewise, it's nothing, only suffering has ceased." So he taught, the Lord Buddha taught that, and thus the author here, Master Aryadeva himself, holds the same view.
봉바야인 타바야인도 아니 케바 아니 티시에 그래서 나 빼는 쿨체베 셔와 차오.
So we can understand this in respect to the example there as relying also to the as applying to the shifting of a load from one shoulder to the next. That is, when one is born into a new state of existence, it might be the alleviation of some suffering that one was undergoing in a previous state of existence, but it's not that one has achieved actual happiness. Rather, it's just a slightly less intense form of suffering has been initiated at that time.
매번이 소소기위 동안이 대화를 요다를 미토나 강그 동안 주주바 대화 세제 지암메스 왔다 되겠다 가데 동안 란잔바 회장 대한의 대회 때문에 아니 동안 가서래 망의 란잔바데 명어바 있으나
So then one might say, real suffering exists, but it is not apparent because pleasure has concealed it. And this then explains the topic that for ordinary beings, ordinary living beings, it's not the case. There's no suffering, there's no pleasure or happiness which properly or completely overcomes the suffering that they're undergoing. And this is explained in verse 48. If common beings do not see suffering because pleasure disguises it, why is there no pleasure which obscures suffering, which overcomes it entirely?
소소기비 동아 데니스 가다 소소기비 동안이 동아 란잔바 회장 소소기비 동안이 소원 대회 요바타 채나 메도나 소원 대회 요바타 채나 메도나 동아라 또치비 대화 요거나스 동아라 또치비 대화 요거나 요 관계 아니 동아 드바 주비 동아대 아니 드바 주바모 동아 드바 주비 대화 세자와 짱 메데
This is then explained in the commentary. Why is there no pleasure which obscures suffering? The reason given to show that there is no real suffering, even though ordinary beings don't see it, because pleasure kind of obscures it temporarily. If real suffering exists, but common beings do not notice it, because pleasurable feelings disguise it, or pleasurable sensations disguise it, there should be pleasure which is stronger than suffering. Why is there no pleasure that can obscure suffering? Because ordinary people do not have real pleasure.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And that makes it that better than much. Bena Mishi Lambochi Deve. I need trouble Nimbal Lambochi Deve, trouble Nimbal Hungsins. Lamje do that to be Zawa. 7月3星巴拉是在土外个啥哇？安尼7月3星巴拉9月，安尼9月拖把我呢主全部给主全部搞把我呢多少钱比搞把我呢多少钱比你定呢长在头把爸爸2把拉3把西，第二3把西路，在别来讲呢7万남자 코라 침비 랑젠지 대 가위 침비 낭홍 세체도 개위 레람지 자 두비 자와 주와래 주베 토바 오네 나송고 조지 간에 뉴몬베 또지 이바치 자투와 자와 남미지 자투와 자와 남미지 자투와 자와 남미지 7월 40일 유유도 온 시비 장지 토비 로냐와라 담바 대당 자외 동아마도 대화랑 잡아 준세자매 세답배는 뭐지야.
So there's a long example here which illustrates this. For example, we take the example here of a man who is chased by an enraged elephant, and he's fallen into an old well, but halfway down into the well, he's grabbed onto a bunch of durva grass. Durva's a tough kind of grass, and but that durva grass is being nibbled at by mice, but he's holding on to that grass. And then at the bottom of the well, there's a huge snake waiting for him to fall. And on the sides of the well as well, there are pythons which are curled up and sort of writhing in towards him. But from above, there's a beehive up above, and there's some honey that's dripping out of that beehive, so that drops of it come down, and he's able to, they fall into his mouth, and he's able to taste the honey that's dropping down. And so while he's in that situation, he thinks, this is so nice. This is pleasurable. So just like that, foolish, childish beings are bound in samsara by means of, who are bound in the cycle of samsara are harassed by the elephant of being bound in samsara, and they've fallen into the well of old age. So throughout the duration of their life, for about halfway through it, they're being maintained by the force of some karma, positive karma that they created in a previous life, virtuous karma. But at the root of that virtuous karma they've created, which is like the durva grass, that long grass, there's mice which are nibbling away at that, and we're holding on to that grass. The mice being like positive and negative karma that are chewing away at it. And from below, there's at the bottom of this well of our lives, there's a huge snake, which is the lower realms of existence, waiting. And then from the sides of this well of our lives, pythons are coiled up, which are symbolize the mental afflictions. And then at the root of the durva grass that we're holding on to, mice, which are like the maturation of the karma that we've created in the past, positive, negative karma, are nibbling away at that. And so even though that's the case, we're experiencing the taste of drops of honey, which is the craving that we have towards desirable objects, attractive objects. And just like that, apart from suffering, there's not even the slightest bit of real happiness that we have.
Oh yeah. That is it. 추도 차자 매도지 소소교회 댄자테 내가 대신시에 남지 뜨목군지 타송 뜨목군지 가서도 뜨목군지 뜨목군지 타수 측직문도 가려나데 되게 내 가래로 와서나 때문에 리동아도 공부했음 바데 가데 리동아제랑시 이나 아니 때문에 리동아도 숨발라 거면 봐 주로 어셋 가데 리동아제랑시 이나 때문에 리동아도 숨발라 거면 봐 주데 년전 초시 아니 때문에 거 와신도 어셋 신나
So someone might say here, if the body's nature were suffering, it would be unnecessary for the teacher, Lord Buddha, to say that the body is suffering, just as there is no need to point out that the sun is hot. And the verse here responds to that by saying, common beings must be told, you are not free from your attachment to suffering.
Oh, yeah.
And certainly the Tathagatas therefore have said, this is the worst confusion of all.
다테나 깨매데스 리동아지라시 이양 다 말이 보면 뜨무고 왕기 리동아지라시 임바다 마도신 대어라 손에 아니 동아지라시라 대어라 손에 코르코베 코르코네 서거나 아니 최동 덤베 최동아라 대어라 손에 차바다 차와 매도 세거 최동 차자 매도시 매도 시 아니 소소교원을 때마 찾고서 소소교원 단자태
So there is no such fault as that, for the body's nature is suffering, but because of confusion one does not realize it, and thinking it is pleasurable when circles in cyclic existence. So our teacher has therefore said, mistaking suffering for pleasure, you are not free from attachment. The Lord Buddha has taught that, and other Tathagatas also have taught that. So common beings have to need to be told that, because they misconstrue that which is actually of the nature of suffering as if it was happiness, and thus, even though it's actually clearly the case that that which is of the nature of suffering is not happiness, because ordinary beings misperceive it and wrongly grasp onto it or misapprehend it as if it was real happiness, real pleasure, then this has to be explained to them.
Oh yeah. 내가 대신시에나 니 뜨먹군지 타샤송선서 다데 타스면 모두데 되나 내가 대신시와 남지 디가서 체시와 디니 드바 남지 초 드바 탐제 강데 말을 바니 드바오 시 동아 란잠발라 아니 다 더라 뭐바 뜨먹이 타마데 타샤송서
So this is definitely why the Tathagatas have said, and here the text says sister. That actually I think is short for venerable sister to a nun. The foremost of all obstructions is ignorance. In other words, the Buddhas have said that confusing real suffering with pleasure is the worst confusion of all.
That deep bella. 前几路上的来些钱呢，俺那老帮跑的出了，他那买康送我他那，俺来把送去去买碗汤，他那么些个菜，俺那看说的碰住呢送呢，现金没这些买家，康送我的来把送我瞧我，些没动我心头，没动我心头，就没都没给亲戚了给送完了。So
example that's given for this is that there was a servant girl who took her wages, but only did half the work that she was supposed to have done, and then she left. And her mother said that that was not right. She needs to do whatever she takes hold of, and whenever she takes hold of something, she should hold on to it tight. So one day she took hold of a donkey's tail, and though others told her not to hold on, she did not let go, but repeated, whatever you take hold of, hold on tight. So in a similar way, the Tathagatas instructed those of us in the grip of confusion's errors who cling to the idea of suffering as pleasure to develop aversion to suffering.
Oh yeah, that didn't. That's what Chawa Duji Dunga Gombe Suni, that Dunga Ginana, Chawa Duji Dunga Sumi Gombe Suni, Midalayang, Yabarne, Kala New Teddy May. 대지 미다 강이 봐 탐제 동화 세자 줄 어디 승거 말아 가들이 미다 봐 이메지 대화 여도 세나 어젠 세나 아시야
So then this leads into the next topic, which is that the way in which we meditate upon the pervasive suffering of being created by karma and mental affliction. And it says, that which is impermanent is definitely injured, and that which is injured is not happiness, is not pleasurable. Therefore, whatever is impermanent ought to be explained as being miserable in its entirety. So someone might say, even though it's true that the body is impermanent, it's pleasurable. There is pleasure that we can have within it.
Oh yeah. 미다발랑 내버네 세대 대승고서래 나 민지 류라 소바 강 미다바텔라 아니 직제징 내버 네베 이중아 쳐봐 이중계바 쳐봐 강라 이중계위 천지전지 네바 여바테 다와 민베 네바 여바테 다와 민베 대지 아니 사바다 제베 미다바 강이바 탐제 아니 동아와래 세가나 되라 강라 네바 강라 네에 테디민 대지 메다 강연바 탐제 동아 세자 주로서 유중지위 전이지 네바 여바데 다와 민베 균전 대지를 사바다 제위 메다바 강연바 탐제 안에 동아와 세자와 주로서.
So then the line which says that which is impermanent is definitely injured, is damaged, and whatever is injured or damaged is not happiness. And this is explained in the commentary by saying that that view that the body, even if it is impermanent, it has some happiness within it, is not the case. So our bodies, which are this maturation of karma and so forth, are impermanent, and they're definitely injured by being destroyed. They're subject to destruction, and there's something which is suitable actually to have revulsion towards, to renounce or to give up, and something which is has as its basic identity that it ought to give rise to disgust and renunciation, and which possesses all the sorts of injuries and harms that create that identity of giving rise to misery, is not something which is pleasurable. Therefore, whatever is impermanent and is contaminated, any contaminated thing which is impermanent, all of this is given the name suffering.
뭐야, 다시 배대라. 렌즈 중고수 렌자그 중고수 강홍화될 렌자전도 좋아시노.
So the example that's given for this is that, like if you have a pit, salt pit, anything that falls into it gets salty.
Oh yeah, that thing, 예체단이와 라도시비 고와는 뒤에 담발라. 고왕무당 대화란자밤에 받담바다 현지량가 방와 세체, 是吧？但谈不得了，고왕무 되라. 고왕무니 단지 재배스, 단지 재배 도저 코라 좋아 깨네스, 단지 재배 아니 뒤튼 아니 가서 세배 도저 코라 좋아 깨네, 라나메 배 창주라 거비 체도 돌에 깨와 동아로 写送바탕. 가서래 청원비 단지 때 가서래 저기 가서. 다 고디 테마서 가서 니와레부 풍봉아 동아 시송데 세카라다 동아 군주 지대다 단에 세바테다 인 세데데레 가서래 사자서 라만두베 제나 사자칸이 테라 사나 군도 자와죠 아니 가서지 상군도 자와죠 나도 고디 테마서다 동아 군주 지대다 단에 세바타다 이 사자게 민게 남자들아 주인의 조아래 사체 금액이 남자 동아 사체 아니 군중 동아와 군중 따위네 안 쓰바 대다 민게 남자 샤요 세당 동아 예수 댐비칠 지르말이 동아로 동아 대한 저거 치마 동아 예수 댐비칠 지르말이 동아로 세당 用也都没用到太来线上。见那么几，他的这个路子嘛，我们跟路子都相关的。
So then, next that leads to the an exposition of in brief, the necessity of composing this explanation. This second chapter, they're called chapters, but you can also call them expositions of a subject. So the second exposition or second chapter, the reason for composing that is taught in brief. And so first there's the actual necessity, primary subject here, and then that's explained as follows. The person who composed this treatise, Master Aryadeva, did this in order to generate aversion towards samsara within those who are to be trained by this kind of instruction. And then by having developed that aversion for samsara, in order to, ultimately, in order to place them in the status of unexcelled awakening. And so here it says that in the sutra, it is said that birth is suffering. And likewise, the master, the Buddha himself, the teacher, taught within the Abhidharma Shastra, the treatise on metaphysics, that the entirety of the 5 aggregates, appropriated aggregates, are suffering. And this is explained in the Abhidharma Kosha, the Treasury of Metaphysics, in which here this verse is quoted from the Abhidharma Kosha, the Treasury of Metaphysics, to enumerate the synonyms of contaminated things. The first one is suffering, the second is origin, the third is world, the fourth is the basis of views, or wrong views, and then existence. All of those are synonyms or different terms which are used to indicate contaminated things. And then in addition to that, there's a pair of lines which says, because they possess one of the 3 kinds of suffering, whatever they are, in their entirety, they are suffering. Again, referring to those things that were mentioned above. And also, a pair of lines also says that that which is attractive or unattractive, and things which are neither attractive nor unattractive, but are contaminated. So all of that is a way of enumerating the different aspects of contaminated things.
Oh yeah, that is the long the march in the you don't know that tell us Janami is or take that. She saw you combat down permanence. That one but joking or call the shabaki or long to that get dambagi. And or combat down la pane, calling Yemi Shebe, calling Yemi Shebe, charging. 아니 좋아한다 봐남 기바침보다 저위 텐도 아니 제대 스고와디 다지로 와도 셔버자 먹고와디 제대 대한 때문에 그런 타라 최저 이름 뭐 코나 파마라 소비 내서 마주와네 가야 메데스 코나 심전단자 랑 파마라 소비 내서 마주와네 가야 메데 예수바 통하네 장주선반 남자 심전나 티바침비 초지 티바침비 수지 생지 코와란 드라이브지 쳐봤어 봤다라 단지를 잡아 비장 아랍지 잡아 당보시 아니 거의 이미 시에네 뭐 장주도 생지부 수단 바래
So then the reason Master Aryadeva introduced all of these subjects in order to demonstrate what his intention in doing this is that he taught the subjects that we've covered thus far, as well as the subjects in the next 2 chapters, as a means to generate fear of samsaric existence through recognition of the consequences of being in samsara. And this is intended for those who desire liberation from samsara. And yet it wasn't done merely for that, but it was composed for the sake of those who are to be conjoined with the Mahayana, the greater vehicle. And the evidence for that is as follows, the teacher said, "Oh monks," this is a sutra. He's addressing the monks at that time. "Oh monks, you have wandered for a long time in samsara, and during that time, there's no one that has not served as your mother and father." So that sutra then shows that all sentient beings have been one's mother and father without exception. So teaching that shows that it's also the case for bodhisattvas, that one needs to, in order to be able to liberate, save all sentient beings from the ocean of samsara by means of the ship, which is the technique or method that you find in the Mahayana. The bodhisattvas have to be able to endure the sacrifices that they have to undergo to do that. And thus, the author of the text, this text, composed it, and in particular, composed the first 4 chapters of it, so as to first explain the negative consequences of samsara, and then in order to extensively teach the way in which one generates the bodhicitta, form of bodhicitta, which is the aspirational type of bodhicitta.
Oh yeah. 난 늘 참비 단 공도 샤바 참바기 결론다 체자 이름 보고 코와 심지어 코와지 참바라 맨에 아니 자주 그쯤 계속 그 도대 늘 참비 쓰제디 아니 가서래 로비 인기 제배 제래 총나 제배 제래 총나 대마서 청업이 돈 도지도 시도 싸라 도지도 싸라 내가 때나 라마 카와까지 로비 인기 엄바 대둥가 도면바 시장 카와카시 루루에서 대다 지리 도시바 다송어 루루에서 지리바 도시바 나시 인연 되그래서.
So then these verses that were are cited here actually are they also appear within the Abhidharma Kosha, the treasury of metaphysics, which was taught by the master Vasubandhu. But even though it's the case that they appear there, it's clear that these are actually the words of the Abhidharma Sutra, the Buddha's own exposition of metaphysics that we find in the sutras. And depending upon this fact, some gurus, lamas, have said that so some masters have said that the master Vasubandhu does not hold that the 6 treatises on metaphysics are sutra, but even though that is the case, that Master Vasubandhu himself doesn't hold the 6 treatises on metaphysics as sutra. Nevertheless, Master Nagarjuna and Aryadeva, they hold that some of these texts are sutra. It seems to be the case that Master Nagarjuna and Aryadeva hold that some of the the statements that are found in the 6 treatises on metaphysics can be understood as sutra, or are acceptable as sutra.
Oh yeah, that you want the one on them about Tambatella. Chuna Rashi to a do them about Kalembi. Only one will lose Shabalani. 东阿让咱把越讲，在东阿让咱当，也个让咱现在看看钱是吧？看钱让咱，对东阿让咱他就喜欢那些，东阿起这么点讲，俺东阿既然起来都有靠，都有我主要没把人家让咱说是吧？人家路上没别开，路上没把开那边，我们路去写把那东阿让咱把越讲。 사제지 대화 란자바 중세자 매신 사제기 초원 대화대 치점 때네 안에 동아지 뭘 주와래 안에 콜라 대화를 매와 인자 그 동아 치쳐와 대화가 받자마도 란시지 대화 제매바 인자 안에 사제지 대화 란자바 중세자 매신 대여발라 내와 토마단 치아바 다 광아르 치아바 그 받자 광아르 치아바다 동 치아바다 동아 칠제지 동아 대화 아니 동아 중세 식충주 내가 오거나 소와 스바 중화라 더러나 바샤고 소 나바샤고
So then showing the next follows the demonstration that there's no real pleasure or happiness in samsara. Here, although Master Nagarjuna and Aryadeva, his disciple, is following him, within the position that's held by Master Nagarjuna and accepted by him, phenomena don't possess even an atom of establishment by means of their own intrinsic nature, intrinsic existence. And that being the case, even though that is the case, there is real or actual suffering that exists within samsara, but contaminated pleasure is not real pleasure in any way whatsoever. And if there was, if contaminated pleasure was actual pleasure, there would be all sorts of different problems, inescapable faults that would occur, as has been previously been explained, and instead it's clear that Master Nagarjuna and Master Aryadeva posit what we call pleasure as being the mere alleviation of a sensation, which is the mere alleviation of discomfort, a sort of a sensation of comfort which arises when suffering has been removed, but is not the actual properly, pleasure or happiness as it would be necessarily, if it was real, as it would be defined. So when we're in a state when suffering has diminished a little bit in its force because of the alleviation of suffering, we call that pleasure, but that's merely a kind of sense of relief or comfort that arises from that condition, not real pleasure or happiness.
Oh yeah. 다 되라. 숨바 현진량가 반대와랑 잡아 해봐 담바들 현진량가 빵와태. 로베이니지 안 파발라라. 로베 파발라라. 제진 제바를 레시 대발라 고원 대발라 디트바 차데. 아니다. 대와랑 잡아 매바 파발래. 안에 숨바들라. 고원 다바들라 디트바 차데. 시소 대와랑 잡아다 동아랑 잡아니 예면라 원전 도마 잡아니스. 동아 란자바였나 대화 란자바 요고래 대화 란자바면나 동아야 란자 요고 말에 권중 그 받다니 그래서 대화 란자바다 동아 란자 유면라 권중 도만 잡아니 아니 자我等住开连吧原本的下雨录音啦录住给就开说的一年给파발라게 오 된도 샤지 샤와 예매도 샤게 루인라 대라니 대와 제베 가바 투만 제데세 어디 이렇게 람발라니 아니 대와 제바 파발라기 가바 투만 제데 초안 대와 라신지 예나 아니 라르게와 되메바 타와장 시양 제비 초다다 오 여바 되나 아니 내 여바 되나 칸라야 라 말야바 제고 아니 귤라 라 말야바 아니 규게바 고메바 타와당我等把面呢，这米你个他话说，我等把面呢，我没把点呢，俺那这米你个他话当，点嘛不我把让些剧员呢，他话说是那把推米过呢，俺那那边爬爬来了，啊。拉当这边轻松比干没把松手，跟就把个干没把松手是，跟就拉没把。
So then the last part of the explanation here, or next to the last anyway, is showing that getting rid of any kind of residual criticism that might be addressed to the exposition that's been given here. Now, Master Vasubandhu has criticized Master Aryadeva in as it says in the commentary on his own commentary on the Treasury of Metaphysics, and it says there's a statement there which says, well, now we should question someone who disparages or underestimates happiness or pleasure. What that is referring to is because in the Abhidharma Kosha, the Treasury of Metaphysics, Master Vasubandhu has acted as if he accepts the position that things are real, that functional things that arise from causes and conditions are real. They have a degree of reality which is not accepted by Madhyamakas. And so in this question has an implicit criticism of Master Aryadeva here, and he presents the position that Master Vasubandhu does, that real pleasure, real happiness, and real or actual suffering are equally existent or non-existent. Now, in this text, that sort of position is not held. That is, as we said, there's real suffering, actual suffering, but there's no actual or real pleasure. And the reason that the equivalence of pleasure and suffering, happiness and suffering is not made, is that in order to do that, one would necessarily have to hold the position that things are real, established as they, existing as they appear in some sense, and one necessarily would have to do that, and that's not acceptable. So here in the commentary, Master Chandrakirti has negated that position in multiple ways. For example, he said that if pleasurable sensations existed by means of their own intrinsic nature, then it would be pointless for these pleasurable sensations to arise. They wouldn't arise. There would be no reason for them to be produced again because they would exist intrinsically. And then likewise that if 신영 드레브 속라 대다 뭐보 유바테나 그냥 신영 드레브 속 대다 뭐보
드레브 속 대다 뭐보 덴바 유바테나 아니 덴바이나 샹라라 말해봐 요 유ike바라 거메 바타바.
And moreover, if the collection of the results were real things, existed as real things, then it would be pointless, no necessity for them to be produced by means of their causes. That is, if something existed real, a functional thing in particular existed as real, then it would be pointless for its causes to give rise to it, because it would exist independent of the causes. And then here there's a technical term of and if, on the other hand, these things were really non-existent, if they existed in a real non-existent fashion, it would be impossible for things to arise. That is, if things really were non-existent, them being really existent or really non-existent would entail all sorts of unacceptable consequences. In the second case, if things were really non-existent, then it would be impossible for them to arise or be produced by their causes and conditions. And then likewise, if the past and the future things existed by means of their own intrinsic nature, then they would exist in the present. If something that existed in the past, functional thing, had existed by means of its own intrinsic nature, it would be here now. And if something that will exist in the future existed by means of its own intrinsic nature, then it would also be present right now without having to be produced. So all of these different kinds of faults would arise, and Master Chandrakirti has expressed all of these unacceptable consequences, and in that way shown that Master Aryadeva is free from any kind. His statements in the text that we've studied so far, and in the future too, is completely devoid of any sort of occasion for criticism.
Oh yeah. 他提起了，告诉的，让咱下去没习惯，让咱没讲，让个成绩没讲，俺那其他那个我他觉得下去太不给， 랑자지 주바 나양 랑자지 마주장 아니 지나는 거 오라랑 거 아니 자체 태바디 따딩의 저기 롱데 마 누구도와 저와 배나딩의 저올래其他所有你们去推拿所有你们去推拿 아니 교 관배 동신 좋아 이세 아니 어디 가라더니 추위见他 참와기 아니 무주라 추위 공부 통화 무주 출 통화 무주 출 통화 무주 출 마도와 나신제는 치다나고 오 탐제 아랑전지 주바와 랑신지 주바 나장 랑신지 마주바 티시도 셔와자바 무주라니 추니 예매데 삼제 몸바텔라 통데데세 아니 미추 나와데 통화 대화 제와데 무주 추나니 삼제 몸바텔라 무주 추드니 통데제와데 미대 추니 동화 예매니 천하동제 티시 셔와지세
So thus, it's the case then that all of these things that we've been discussing are completely devoid of even a single particle of intrinsic existence. They're empty of intrinsic existence. Happiness, suffering, pleasure and pain, all of these phenomena that we've examined, most of which are, in fact, all of which are functional things, are devoid of any kind of intrinsic existence. Nevertheless, their functionality is completely demonstrable. We can show how it is that causes and conditions give rise to pleasure and pain, all of the other phenomena of the world. There's no, it's not only the case that they're being devoid of intrinsic existence doesn't preclude them functioning and existing in functional relationships. Rather, it's because they're devoid of intrinsic existence that they're able to exist in functional relationships, to act as causes and conditions or effects arising from causes and conditions. And all of that is perfectly demonstrable. And thus, here it says in the Samadhi Raja Sutra, the sutra which is the king of meditative concentrations, that it's even these things appear to worldly beings as if they're real, but they don't exist as they appear in that way. They're unreal. They're devoid of the intrinsic existence that worldly beings superimpose onto them, that sense of realness that people falsely impose on them. And it's the illustration of this is given in the sutra, where it says that just like in the middle of a summer day, a thirsty person who is tormented by heat and is traveling looks at a mirage and thinks and sees it as if it's a mass of water. We should consider all phenomena to be just like that. There's no water at all in a mirage, but confused sentient beings desire to drink that water. This unreal water is not something that one's able to drink, and one should consider should understand that all phenomena are just like that.
Oh yeah. 写作送把大儿子看电竞这话中话的，俺那让心去追东把开了呢，他呢来对的，俺那他没上我来脏话当，东岸人的话说是真把。 落台大，俺那7级路3把了100把了，当这大都这边落台大7级路3把了100个，俺那100个过来送的。
So just as it's taught in the sutra there, dependent origination is accepted as being empty of being established by intrinsic nature, and we have to accept it in that way. Yet, therefore, we ought to make effort to understanding just even conventionally, depending upon convention, that holding things as being pure or pleasurable, happiness and so forth, grasping them in that way is erroneous. We need to think, make effort to being able to think about how it is that just in dependence upon convention, that that which appears to be pure is actually impure, that which appears to be real pleasure or happiness is in fact suffering, and understand that the misapprehension of things which are impure and miserable as being pure and pleasurable is erroneous.
오야 드리메와 코와자서 뜬다메바네 녀몬 추선다기 레바시 셈시수시 쪼와 잼메지 배대 장지줄라 점바차스 다자서 뭐简单的 코와자서 뜬다메바 나란조 다 코타중 공도 시와 나시 코와자서 뜬다메바 내와 가서 녀몬 아니 뜬다메비 코와니 자조 나니 내바데 대자라서 메사베 추선균이 리세베 아니 들이 수라 자수체 전에 초랑 수바나시 다때 직바더지 뭐다是吧 코와 자주 뜬다 매반에 니모버 추승이 타기 아니 레버 시리스 리선이 세바 된다위 동아지 나와대 셈시 수시 교와 재미주시 교와 재고 그래 오랑 아니 텐데스 녀 가서래 코르자 내수 삼바기 내중 교와 나시 셈시 현라야 대단 대견님 아니 이제 개니 대다 동아 자소라 아니 덴비 시도 아니 라남 바양다 바토 산제요 공반 안 루비 루발라 아니 잠바 쳐고래 세제 게미제 배대 창지 줄라 잠바 차
So here then the concluding verse says that here he's addressing us, all of us, as we who abide in this ocean of samsara, which is which the depth and the width of it, the extent of it, there's no limit to it at all, and we're harassed, intensely harassed by crocodiles and sharks, who are the mental afflictions, and who has a mind would not become disgusted and develop aversion towards that, and therefore it's appropriate to make effort and to strive towards the accomplishment of awakening. Here, this verse is modeled on, probably modeled on one that we find also in the works of Master Dharmakirti, where the same sentiment is expressed, that samsara is like an ocean, which is the depth and the extent of it is unknowable, is limitless. And he says the same thing, essentially, that the mental afflictions are like sharks, which harass us, and anybody who has a mind ought to be disgusted by this and try to achieve liberation. Here, the last two lines where it says anybody who thinks about this why wouldn't they give rise to aversion towards it? We can apply that to ourselves in terms of striving for liberation if we understand our own situation, but if we expand the application of this and think about how all sentient beings, not just ourselves, are in this ocean of samsara. Therefore, we can use this as a basis for developing great compassion for all other suffering sentient beings in the samsaric ocean, and use it as a foundation for developing compassion towards them, and then bodhicitta, the aspiration to achieve Buddhahood, to free them from samsara.
Oh yeah, that day 参到吧，参去去吧，就毛钱是吧？然后就去吧，你为这吧我钱，那第一钱呢，他长得就刚是大巴掌，对吧？那没上完了，长完真怕。我这个他亲戚多是吧？没上完了，长完真怕他，弄完了掉完真怕，是钱的，他都是，机会干了，他没上完了，长完真怕，什么真怕的，什么课没上完，让心都300关呢？早晚真不亲戚老帮员，他下班了，刘兄下班，才能下班，你也别拿呢。但刘兄下班太那样，我也别拿呢。我谈不得，我都他这下午么个讲，CPU 做把long间呢，成把干把你是的啦。他们 CPU long间做把干呢，成把干把你是我都这个他们接了听过着吧？我讲是吧？CPU 做把long间呢，成把干把呢，有你心头准备讲，有了没都有门的是。没把俺的却有了，我们这屋没把确实，在生活头是吧？开始生活的现在，离东啊街上是一样，有一度完了，long就比这亲呢，你我带我去 아니 류의 땜발 리소시나
So this that concludes the the second chapter, and within the different erroneous conceptions, erroneous ideas of holding that which is impermanent as permanent, holding that which is suffering as pleasure, covered by the first two chapters. Then the third chapter explains how it is that the erroneous idea that that which is actually impure, unclean, is pure or clean, and so there's the explanation of the method by which one gets rid of that mistaken conception, erroneous conception, which grasps impure things as pure, is explained here in the third chapter. There's multiple subdivisions, topics of this chapter. We won't go through all the outline in detail. That's given again in the appendix to the translation. But here the first topic, which is treated, is that showing how it is that one doesn't achieve any real satisfaction by enjoying oneself with objects of craving, the objects that we crave when we use them and enjoy them. We don't get real satisfaction from them, and that's treated in the first verse of this chapter, where it says, though the body's nature is suffering, it gains pleasure from satisfaction through the experience of attractive objects. Thus, the use of such objects is appropriate. That's here someone is holding the position that the body actually can provide us with pleasure by enjoying attractive things. And the reply to that is given in the first verse of this chapter. Regardless of the amount of time concerning objects, there is no limit. Your exertion for the body's sake is, like a bad physician's exertion, useless.
Oh yeah, 那对了，那这汤不啦？俺那有了做把long切，俺那爬都闹啥玩意？俺有了七八张钱呢，俺那7点半没人把打死，7点半没人把打死。我那天有你心头准备讲谁的？搞完了所谓有你心头准备讲，俺那3把这边有了，这边有了。 아니 사바이와 말에서 사바네 사바이 무투네 사바이와 말에서 무투바서 사바만로 사바네 사바이와 마인데 마인 비체레서 대배라 가르래서나 아니 가서로 멤버가 쳐유라 나와 저번 멤버 주 세게 멤버가 내소유 니와 메베스 소재 제자 제장 내서 그 니와 메가 그 먼저 제자 소재 제자 제장 매배 도움에 받다 추지리라 대화 친비 텐도 나와 채와 안 도움에 받고 그래 시간라 어디서 멤버가 쳐유라 나와 도움에 받총.
So this is explained, the reply to that is given in the commentary. Having enjoyed things fully during one's youth and then amassed wealth, it does not follow that one will later turn to religious practices when free from attachment to such things. Regardless of the amount of time one spends, even if it's eons, one will not come to an end of the objects one craves by reaching their limit, for there is none. And then the explanation of the last two lines of the verse is that though a bad physician who is incapable of healing gives you treatment, his efforts are fruitless. Your exertion to satisfy the body with pleasure is similarly fruitless.
Oh yeah.
So the example given here is like a monkey wearing a leopard skin is a source of worry, constant anxiety to the other monkeys.
Oh yeah. That's ni wa sibi yu chi zam jia ba zam ji is. Oh, 是吧？大家记住了，其实么家吧zam ji，安尼配话句是吧？配话句就强调怎么就别的。两把钱吧，感谢了，30多把没去行，电信吧也没弄了，这里拍话样提醒我。 是的，对别称把他有了什么民主罗是呢？对别称把他了有了什么民主的先呐是。
So then the next, that leads into the next topic, which is no matter how much we experience or enjoy the objects that we crave, that craving simply increases, but we don't come to a place where we're free from our attachment to them. And here someone might say, well, when we enjoy the things that when we're satisfied with by desire, that is through our lust or desire towards things, then we don't crave them anymore. The answer to that is given in that in verse 52, which says, just as the craving for earth does not stop for those that subsist on it, similarly longing for sensual pleasure grows in people as they indulge.
Oh yeah. 나대 가서 오래서나 신부 사이샤 담바체바 가시라 사대 담바체바 가시라 사나 신부 사이샤 담바체바 가시라 사이세바 사라세비 세바 도바 메바 치다와신 사서 도바 메치신 사라세비 세바 도바 메바 치신도 세비 유대 신비 민남라야 강라 세바 그 유대 신비 아니 사자지我得到了尤其称把没把马赛아니 단도 대비라와 관에 건도 대바 관에 건도 폐와 대신어
So the refutation of that idea that by enjoying things that we desire, being satisfied, then we won't crave them anymore. The example that's given is like a worm that lives off of earth. It no matter how much it enjoys or utilizes the earth, eats it in order to survive, its craving for that earth is never stopped. And similarly, when we humans, no matter how much we use the objects that we crave, however much we resort to them and utilize the objects that we crave, we're never satisfied by those objects. Not only that, our desire for them, the wish to have them increases more and more, just like the worm.
배나 꼼배니 베르다 신호세로 꼼배 동이 아니리다 동아 텐도에 바나시네 에센스다 딘바레
So it's the same thing like a deer that are tormented by thirst.
단니와 르짱와 샤바 미리비 군자 제월 샤바텔라 페메지르라 샤바 까바당 리미자와 미동신도 샤바 까바 당보리 일에 샤바 까바라 조세가라 수제와라 샤바 미리바다 나도 마체가나 담 샤바 마보지 차네 당보 아니 페메지 수제와라 샤바 미리비 군자니 다들이 페메글라 치바라 타다 조세 예미신 수sen신기 지양 논전나 결라 모조 피치세 세가나 다디 이사레
So the next comes showing that a more extensive explanation of the reasons why it's improper, incorrect to be obsessively attached to a body as if it is a pure thing, as if the purity of the body has multiple subdivisions. It begins by showing a refutation or negation of attachment to the female body, and that has multiple subdivisions as well. We won't go through all the outline here, but the first of these is showing the reason why it's improper to be attached to a beautiful female form, and that's given in the verse 53. Among all women, there is not the least difference with regard to sexual intercourse. When others too enjoy her appearance, what use is this perfect woman to you?
가데 공기 이미 때문에 아니 비밀 투모와라 차바도 니장 아니 수당 기술 하반제이 비밀라 차바도 민수贤나是大神呐，对啦，平面棍啦，吃吧啦，他在中山原民警是个了平面就靠吧啦， 강바 뭐 차바 강바 제 차바 되는 강바 결라 소당 지주 제위 모조기 지세대 대라라바 참매를 받아 근지 매장위 초 랑경한게听하신 다도 잡아 류지 총재기 매장위 동공도 주와 아니 가서는 세간다 교망부 루비 매장와看着吧，睡前吧，睡前吧，相当，没那个没上完台了，让给老亲戚马路，亲戚老马多吧，台了吃比热完了，上岸他在就在这要把门行，谁干了他的这些把人，首先给你老姐来劝了毛叫记下，他在就在原门行，在的等于是的，哎呀。
So then here someone might object and say, even if pointing out the above-mentioned disadvantages can stop one from desiring ordinary women, it cannot stop desire for women whose appearance and behavior are exceptionally beautiful. And then the answer is given in the verse, and the commentary elaborates on that by saying, what use is this perfect woman with her beautiful appearance and behavior to you who lust for a woman's body? It is inappropriate to feel particularly attracted to her, since the unclean part of all women stinks and constantly drips of its own accord. It is a sewer for the body's filth, and like a lavatory readily receives the filth emptied into it by many people. Except to erroneous perception, there is not the least difference of good or bad regarding the sensation of intercourse with this cesspit-like dark filth.
Oh yeah, that got us. So there were lava someone. Pena, Pima, Nabashi, like Cheddar, soon and or she may be soon and Zion room, Chibadamba, the Keba Meto Shema or Taro.
So since a woman's appearance may also be enjoyed by other men and even by dogs, crows, and so forth, it is unreasonable to feel particularly attracted by beauty. And then there's an analogy that's given. An unattractive woman's husband told her she was ugly looking. She replied that ugly or good looking, when it comes to sexual intercourse, there is no difference. More analogies about this can be found in Chandrakirti's commentary as well.
Oh yeah, that didn't you was with our Kona Chabi to Mangewani, Kala Kai Yonjua, Teniti, Timberlum, Kiso Namla Tumo, lodging about Chechisha, or Digi Carso Resana, lodging about Lochiji Loche, Suits, Zewa Kona like Gucci Chapa Miribata, Serava, on it, Chicha. 像伢不依赖，伢么都把打人，结果扛了，偏偏扛一段我就话的呢，腿成把弄行，其他假如那了呀，让给莫了差吧，他们我一边说，现在扛一用就把腿成把弄，其实那了他们我在对不的哦。
So then, for what reason does it follow that an unintelligent and misguided person like you will only be attracted to someone beautiful? It does not. And then the verse here says, whoever sees her as appealing thinks himself satisfied with her. Since even dogs and the like share this, why, fool, are you attracted? Just as grandma appeals to grandpa, any man who finds a woman attractive feels satisfied with her. Even dogs, crows, and the like share this desire for their own mates. It is like the evil spirits who are prejudiced about the attractiveness of their wives. And then it goes on explaining the commentary.
Oh yeah, so
that example is explained later by Chandrakirti. We'll stop there for now.
예바소
떡이 적당
모수제 요라yen 바소 뇌당원제 밤밤에 아부기 레시네 두사랑 살로와 진예로
이름
구루라나멘다라 나다야미
장주
주센조ren 보제마